Welcome to Sputnik, with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The plight of the Chagos Islanders, long championed by the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, incidentally, has been showcased on the Sputnik previously, via Ben Vogel and its president, Alan Venkatasan. But we just can't stay away from the Indian Ocean paradise, whose population was ethnically cleansed to the last man, woman and child by a British Labour government, so that the US could have a military base there.
In recent times, despite another Labour Foreign Secretary's denial, it has even been used, at the very least, as a staging post to the charnel house of the war on terror.
On Wednesday, thanks to our first guest and his party, the SNP, the British Parliament will be forced to confront the issue again. The Scottish National Party have secured a debate on the issue, which everyone should follow closely. That man is Dr. Paul Monaghan, MP for half of the Scottish Highlands. Dr. Paul, thanks for joining us. Just for those viewers who don't actually know what happened to the people of the Chagos, briefly describe it, please.
Oh, I'll try to. It's a long and interesting story. It goes back to the mid-60s. Just before the Seychelles Islands and Mauritius were made independent, the UK government annexed the Chagos Islands and forcibly expelled the inhabitants from those islands. Most of them moved to Mauritius, some of them came to the UK. The sad aspect is that their human rights weren't recognised in that process of expulsion, and they were persuaded to expel them on the basis that they were contract labourers. That's how they explained it to the world, against the facts, really. I think it's a damn indictment that the UK government persuaded the UK Parliament that these people were not Indigenous peoples.
It was a Labour government too, by the way.
It was Harold Wilson who authorised the expulsion, indeed. And they also persuaded the UN that they weren't Indigenous peoples either. So a real breach of human rights, and that fundamentally I think is the issue.
And the people have never accepted it.
The people of Chagos, the Chagosians, have never accepted it, and why should they? I think they're quite right to fight for their cause, quite right to fight for their islands, and quite right to fight for the right to return there and to re-establish themselves as a viable community. Now,
the Parliament is debating it, thanks to you and your party, the SNP. Congratulations on that, on Wednesday. What's going to be said, as it were, from your front bench? And what's the government likely to reply?
I think I should say, first of all, that it's not just about the SNP. I'm taking this forward under the auspices of the all-party parliamentary group on the Chagos Islands. That's one of the few all-party parliamentary groups in the UK Parliament that has full cross-party representation. So it's not just the SNP, it is every single political party at Westminster. What we want to do on Wednesday at the Westminster Hall debate is force the UK government, through the Minister for the Foreign Office, to come to the table to answer the questions about what is happening with the Chagos Islanders. And there are a number of specific issues that we want to highlight and discuss. Perhaps chief among them is the fact that next year, 2016, the UK government will be renegotiating the lease of Diego Garcia, which is the military base in the Indian Oceanic Territory that is leased by the UK to the American government. So that lease is going to be getting renegotiated. That, I think, prompts a debate about resettlement of the islands and under what terms that lease might be renewed. It's also the case that imminently the Supreme Court in the UK will be making a judgment on the right of the Chagosians to return to the island. That's imminent, as I say. It's looking very likely that the UK Supreme Court will rule in favour of the Chagosians, and again, that will force the UK government's hand in terms of implementing a programme of resettlement.
It's almost surreal that Harold Wilson, whom I must say I greatly admired, would have done such a thing to please the United States.
If you take a proper look at the history of this whole debacle, it seems that the UK government at the time, under Harold Wilson's leadership, was put under significant pressure to engage with the US government. And there is some suggestion that in leasing the Chagos Islands to the US government, that the UK received a discount on nuclear weapons at the time.
That's certainly been said. Another theory I have is that Wilson was refusing US requests to join the war in Vietnam and to support the Americans in the war in Vietnam. Wilson resisted that, and some say that his flexibility towards the US on the Chagos Islands was in a sense a quid pro quo. Either way, it's entirely shameful.
Yeah.
Not sure which of these two would be the most shameful, and it's time for the British government to do the right thing, isn't it? I mean, far from being contract labourers, these were an indigenous people, and Ben Fogle, sitting exactly where you are now, described to us how their houses are still there. I mean, practically the salt and pepper still on their tables. They were literally ethnically cleansed.
And in addition to that, the phenomenon of rich jet setters who can afford to visit these islands,
people,
these remote islands.
They pull in the Chagos, and instead of putting their tents up or sleeping on board the yacht, they sleep in the houses of the Chagosians who've been chased away.
That must be a big insult for the Chagosians, both in Mauritius and those residing here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the Chagosians have been insulted many times over the last 50 years. As George says, it is absolutely at the point now where the UK government should be accepting responsibility for the actions of previous UK governments and starting to put things right. We're at that pivotal point now, I think, where there are several aspects coming together that suggest that the time is now appropriate to be discharging fully the human rights of the Chagosians and facilitating a viable resettlement on those islands for the people and their future.
Well, I'll tell you what we agreed with Ben Fogle, the famous television personality and very big on this issue. We agreed on our show that if the British government doesn't do the right thing at this pivot, this 2016 pivot, we're going to get ourselves somehow a big, beautiful boat with white sails, and we're all going to get on it.
Sail out there, yeah.
And we're going to sail out there with the Chagosian people and take it back. Who's going to shoot us down?
Well, nobody, I think.
Because they are actually British, yeah? They've got British passports.
They're UK citizens, absolutely, you're quite right. And I think, you're talking about the yachting industry. It's entirely unregulated. If you've got enough money, you can go to the Chagos Islands. So, the suggestion that the Chagos Islands can't be or shouldn't be used for visitors or tourism, things like that, I mean, it's just...
For environmental reasons.
It's a fallacy. It's
yes, that was another of the canards more recently drawn out that, we can't have people there because it's a sanctuary for all kinds of wildlife and flora and fauna, never mind the people who are stuck in Crawley under the flight path of the airplanes in Gatwick. How are you finding, you come from the third sector, how are you finding your time in Parliament? It's probably quite a culture shock coming into what is the oldest and best club in London, as they say.
I think the UK Parliament's an interesting place. You were obviously there for many, many years. It's not somewhere that I feel particularly comfortable, to be honest. I think as a Scottish National Party Member of Parliament, we clearly have an objective, which is to make the voice of Scotland heard in that place. It's to make sure that the people of Scotland have access to equitable and fair policies. That clearly spills over into other peoples, not least the Chagos Islands. So I think, the plight of the Chagosians is very much something that's in my mind and several of my colleagues. Not least because it links back to some aspects of the history of my particular constituency, which is Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, which was the area where we
cleansed.
We were cleansed
for sheep.
Cleansed for sheep during the clearances. Absolutely, I made mention of that in my maiden speech. I linked it to the Chagosians. Interestingly, that prompted quite a lot of correspondence from academics around the world who had been doing research on the Chagosians and their right to return to their islands. And I was very pleased to receive all of that correspondence. I think that what that shows is that, we're not dealing with some secret here. We are dealing with an issue that is renowned, it's obvious, it reflects very badly on the UK government. People know that it reflects very badly on the UK government. It stands in stark contrast to everything that we hear them say about the importance of human rights, particularly at this time when they are, and they have been for many years, completely overriding and ignoring the human rights of the people from these islands.
Well, I know that you're a highly intelligent and educated man. But the longer you sit in the British Parliament, the more you'll realise that what they say and what they do are two entirely different things.
Yeah.
Dr. Paul, thanks for coming on board.
Thank you very much.
Sputnik.
Thank you.
Coming up next, they laid out the red carpet for this week's visitor and even the white tie entails China. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Wild horses couldn't have got Jeremy Corbyn into a white tie and tails, but the state banquet held by the Queen for President Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China did.
The visit was a great success, despite some noises of it seemed to open a breach, rare indeed, between Britain and the US, and finally brought Mr. Corbyn face to face with Her Majesty. Not bad for a few days' work.
Joining us now to discuss its significance is our resident China expert, Keith Bennett. Keith, thanks for coming back on board the Sputnik. The visit seemed to have been a great success. We'll come to that in a minute. But much of the discourse of the liberal media was around the issue of human rights. And Simon Jenkins in The Guardian, amplified by me, I think, on Twitter, raised the question, what if the Chinese had raised human rights with us? There's a tremendous hypocrisy in the media on this question, no?
Absolutely, and I think it went right through the media. If you looked at the way ITN reported it on the news at 10, the way the BBC phrased its question to the president, and of course, China is not the country that's engaged in wars around the world. And it would indeed have a lot to say about human rights in Britain if it so chose.
Human rights in Britain and human rights in the countries that Britain is closest to. Saudi Arabia, for example, which is armed entirely now almost by David Cameron, by the British state, and a long line of others. Equally, they gave amazing prominence, certainly on the BBC World, which we were watching because we were out of the country ourselves during it, to demonstrations of a few dozen people. We can have 100,000 people in Trafalgar Square and not make the news, while a few dozen protesters on Tibet or whatever were given endless coverage in the British media.
Yes, and I think that was in stark contrast to the way the government wanted to play the visit for whatever reason, and it was notable how much the handful of protesters were drowned out by the many hundreds and indeed thousands of Chinese people and some others who came along to welcome President Xi Jinping. Of course, that was said to be an organised activity,
as opposed to the
other, which was clearly, presumably not organised. But even if it was organised, which it was, like the overwhelming majority of protests or public events are, it nevertheless reflected the fact that Chinese people, on the whole, feel extremely proud of their country and what it's achieved.
The United States media were indicating, in some cases explicitly, that Britain appeared to be taking a different line towards China to that of the United States. Is there anything in that?
I think that's very clear. If you look at the mood music that the British government went to considerable lengths to put on for the visit, it was very different from the visit that Xi Jinping made to the United States a few weeks ago, where Barack Obama was openly talking almost on the eve of Xi Jinping's arrival, about the possibility of putting more sanctions on China over so-called cyber warfare issues or cyber espionage. With Britain, with the British government, there was no such policy. I think the breach or the difference in approach was there for some time with, for example, if you take the Chinese telecom giant Huawei, who have been systematically kept out of the US market, yet they've been welcomed with open arms in Britain to have their research and development centre here, their European headquarters and so on. And the biggest sign of that was, of course, when Britain became the first major Western power to apply to become a full member of the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which in turn opened the floodgates for a large number of other Western countries, including all of the G7 powers, with the exception of the United States and Canada and Japan. And Canada may, of course, well change its mind now after the election there this week.
Do you think this breach is based in anything other than money, or is it the money talking?
I think from the point of view of the Conservative government, it's the money talking. But I think that Britain has, at least since the end of the Second World War, or perhaps you can say for most of the 20th century, punched above its weight in the international arena. Now, it did that through a basic strategy of the so-called special relationship, that by clinging to the coattails of the United States, it would actually mask its relative decline in international power. And I'm sure there are some people in Britain who are looking at the fact that, relatively speaking, the United States is now a declining power, China is a rising power, and some who would want to actually ride on those coattails as well, in economic terms, whilst staying.
Britain recognised the People's Republic of China before the United States did, and notwithstanding the enormous abscess of the Hong Kong question, has seemed, under governments of both types in Britain, to not want the kind of confrontation with China that many in the US, the hawks, especially in the US, seem to want.
Yeah, of course, it was the Attlee government that opened the first diplomatic relations at consular level with the People's Republic back in 1950s. Britain was the first Western power to open diplomatic relations with the People's Republic. Ironically, the existence of Hong Kong impelled that, because the existence of Hong Kong meant that we had to have some kind of relationship with China, whether we liked it or not.
Indeed. And so, happy days between Britain and China. The United States unhappy about it. All of that sounds like something to welcome. Did most progressive people welcome it, or is there still this residual resentment about China which looks for issues, Tibet or the how do you say it, the
Falun Gong.
Falun Gong, Chinese repression of this cult and so on. Are these residual irritations still holding back progressive people in Britain identifying with China?
I think there's a huge job still to be done to get basically progressive-minded people in Britain to understand what's happening in China. Ironically, I think people like George Osborne get it a lot better than many progressive people, because they're simply looking at it from an economic, or you can say a mercantilist point of view. There's a great deal to be done. I hope that Jeremy Corbyn's meeting with the president has begun a process of a better dialogue between the left in Britain and the Chinese. But China, like every country in the world, obviously has its problems, but it also has a very good story to tell. If people are on the left, they should care about people being lifted out of poverty and the improvement of people's life chances, I think, first and foremost. China has lifted well over 500 million people out of poverty over the last 3 decades. You can't think about poverty alleviation in today's world without looking at China. A Chinese woman lives more than 10 years longer than an Indian woman. These are real human rights achievements.
Well, parallel to this, what you suggest, continued negative image of China, more and more, for example, Chinese language is being offered at schools as a third or even second language. Indeed, nurseries, we are looking ourselves at nurseries that are providing bilingual education to children as young as 2 years old.
Yes, and China itself has put a lot of money into not only Confucius institutes in higher education, but Confucius classrooms in schools and even primary schools. But I think we've got a long way to go until we catch up with, for example, Australia, which has a much better record on Chinese language teaching that we do. And for that, we also need to improve the teaching of Chinese and Chinese studies in British tertiary education, because you can't actually teach Chinese to children unless you have the qualified teachers. And of course, some of them can come from China as well.
Let's look at the state visit then in more detail. What would you say were the primary achievements of the visit?
Well, I think the primary achievements are probably in the economy. There's something like £40 billion worth of business and investment deals that...
Inward investment into Britain?
Basically, yes. And also the Chinese currency, the renminbi, is becoming an increasingly internationally traded and internationally used currency, although of course still way behind the dollar for now. But Britain will be the main external centre for trading in Chinese currency, apart from Hong Kong and Singapore. The London Metal Exchange has signed an agreement where China will have more influence on the pricing of commodities and so on.
Well, of course, the day will come, I hope we both live long enough to see it, where China's political weight in the world will be commensurate with its economic weight, already established as the main economy, the biggest economy in the world, its military weight, its geostrategic weight. China will begin to assert itself a little more clearly in political affairs. Russia, which is, of course, also a great power, is now a big factor in international affairs. Nothing can happen in the Middle East now, for example, without Russian agreement, without engagement with Russia. When do you see that day coming?
Well, I think it's... Marx said once that there are years in which nothing appears to happen, and then there are days into which the events of years are compressed. And I think that's how we'll see China's rise on the international diplomatic stage. And it's already happening to a great extent. I was in China last week, and there was something which I'm guessing was not really reported in the media here, but they had a conference of Asian political parties in Beijing on what President Xi Jinping calls the One Belt, One Road initiative. This is to create a new Silk Route to tie in the economies of China and South Asia and Central Asia and Russia and through to Western Europe. And you had several hundred delegates representing over 60 political parties there, major government parties and major opposition parties. Some of the delegations led by presidents and prime ministers, others by past presidents and doubtless future ones too. That was immediately followed by a global summit on poverty reduction, which brought people like the Vice President of Bolivia, the Minister for Land Reform of South Africa. So China's having a hugely active diplomatic presence. It's not just the state visit to the UK, but basically none of this is covered in the UK media. You mentioned Russia, of course, and I think what's important is that there's a certain division of labour between Russia and China based on their particular interests and where exactly they find themselves in the world. But if you look at the proceedings of the UN Security Council, basically the two coordinate their positions on nearly all the major international events. And of course we saw with the two big military parades, first in Moscow in May and Beijing in September, where you had contingents of the armies of the two countries marching in each other's capitals, something that's never happened before.
Fascinating. Keith Bennett, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, I asked whether the Queen was right to red carpet the Chinese president. And Conor McGeorge says the only thing they're interested in is their money. They will turn a blind eye to their slave trade and harsh ways. Akib Mahmood follows, saying, "Red carpet, our government is so desperate for Chinese money, I'm surprised she didn't pole dance for him."
That's a bit rude, a bit lessee majesty. We disassociate ourselves from that. But nonetheless, as Keith Bennett very clearly laid out, the motivations, particularly of George Osborne, who is being particularly far-sighted in this regard,
It's interesting.
overriding the Foreign Office, and even David Cameron, he realizes that the sun is rising in the east and setting in the west. And if Britain wants a future, it has to have good relations with the East. It's a pity they haven't caught up yet with the importance of Russia.
Well, that's all that we've got time for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.